How many here are Shanghai survivors? Rene, we're it. We're it.
I get it.
Soon both the persecutors and the victims are going to be dead. How many of you are second generation children of survivors, Holocaust or Shanghai? Aha. How many of you have been in Shanghai? So I thank those who are the children of the survivors who are here, because you are carrying our stories. And these stories, I'm really impressed to say, we have been carrying for 64 years, since 1946. Think of it, 7.5 years of exile and 69 years to think about our stories. That's a long time. And 65 years so that our memories become dimmer, or they change, or we re-edit them. So I have come today to tell you two interpretations that I have of our story, and I'll call it the pre-Manli Ho story, my interpretation of Shanghai, and the post-Manli Ho interpretation, a later edition. In fact, Manli is also part of my story, because Manli, your efforts to track down your father and the refugees has been really impressive. And you have made it, your search and your drive is enormous. The fact is, the pre-Manli Ho story is one that I think most of us Holocaust survivors have had, which is, we considered World War II to be the just war. It was an indispensable undertaking. It was the greatest generation war. After all, they had to be fought to rescue the world from the horrors of Nazism, with its globalist ambitious slogan, Heute Deutschland, morgen die Welt, today Germany, tomorrow the world. A war that succeeded in liberating 158 death camps, slave labor camps, with its piled up corpses of gas, with piled up piles of gassed corpses, part of the depraved industrialized assembly extermination of human beings so efficiently invented and administered by Himmler and Eichmann, the rest of their killing crew. We fortunate ones, we struggled on through Shanghai as best as we could. At worst, we suffered from lice, from typhoid, from hunger, and we were stateless, as Rene has told you. And also, we had coffee with Schlag, and we had operettas that people sang. And if the war had not ended, we were going to be taken out to ships, they said, and left alone on the sea, or we could have died by bombing or starvation. The plates were getting thinner and thinner. Nevertheless, we came to a country, America, of such unimaginable opulence, who wouldn't be delirious. A place, for instance, where chewing gum came wrapped in 3 enclosed folders, where toilet paper was produced in a host of pastel colors, and where cars were put to bed tenderly at night in little hutments or garages, specially made for them to protect them like children. It is impressive that many of my refugee friends here regained their equilibrium. I dropped my Shanghai boyfriend quickly, and I found my husband, who's here today, Alan, my husband of 58 years. He had been an ex-American combat soldier who had landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day in Normandy. And in due course, I had the luxury, I had the pleasure, I had the recovery to bear 3 children, 2 of whom are here today, Naomi and Anina. And I returned to school. I eventually got a doctorate. When I was 58 years old, I kept going to school, to school, to school. My ambition in those days to sort of out-Freud Freud, a great hero of my career, practicing Carmel. But there was a cost. We did visit the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We pored over the ghastly, huge canvas-sized notebooks of those whose martyrdom had been officially confirmed. We looked in vain for the relatives, 23 who had been killed and gassed in Europe, in Belgium, in France by the Germans, and we had left a family of about 27 who became dispersed all over the world. I never regained my family, and my family is my nuclear family today. I looked for their names. We also took a great pleasure in the establishment of Israel in 1948 as a place of refuge, a sanctuary for others who, unlike ourselves, had been unable at war's end to find official succor or sanctuary in any of the so-called civilized nations, with their changing quotas, the various diplomatic protocols, the unpredictable political and economic pressures which affected their opening or closing the freedom spigot for the numberless refugees continually clamoring to be let in. I paid a price, I say, because in 1954, 1 year before my oldest daughter was born, I began to have serious nightmares. I had a return at night to the terror of the Nazi era. I experienced a series of debilitating nightmares when I began to relive some of those experiences. I saw American, Japanese bombs crash down upon the Shanghai streets. I heard the voices of German stormtroopers again. I heard them stalking the Viennese Jews, as Rene has showed you, and Manli also. And I relived all of it at night. I functioned during the day, but at night it came back. It lasted for about 9 months. And my husband had the wisdom to just hold me at night. We listened to Eartha Kitt songs. And his genius was that my panic did not panic him, and it went away. And also, in 1973, I made an attempt to tell my children, and we had a Holocaust in Service Day, where I invited my children, their spouses. I laid out all the pictures of all the dead I had, and I brought out documents and papers. I wanted to tell my story. So if you had asked me, by the time I met Manli in 2003, Lotte, your Holocaust days, you've assimilated it, it's over, isn't it? I was sure, it's gone, it's past, I've done it. I'm in the world now, I'm in America. I have an American passport too. So when a call came from my oldest daughter, Naomi, who said that a friend of hers, Dr. Michael Petra's daughter, Rachel, are you here today? She said she was going to come. Rachel, who took a class in Jewish studies, and said she had heard from someone that had come to speak to her class that someone was collecting German passports from people who had gone to Shanghai. Did I still have mine? Frankly, I wasn't very interested. Go back over all this stuff, it was gone. The past is past. The refugee doors closed. And anyway, I wouldn't know where to find the passports. But lo and behold, I was in the garage a few days later looking for some other things, income tax, and I suddenly saw this box, and it looked strange to me. And I opened it up, and there in a pink folder with a blue ribbon neatly tied had lain there for over 55 years with 3 documents. The German Reise passport, the one you saw here. I said, oh my God, I didn't know I had those. But the minute I held them and I looked at my parents' faces, my father was then 41 years old, and I was by this time 59 and 60. And my mother, so young, 38 years old, like a live wire, my whole agitation, my whole connection, my whole link to the past came up. And I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I ran and I called, and I said, I do have a German passport. And at that moment, at that time, what Manli touched upon and what I told you came back to me. I'm going to try to read you a little bit of that. Siblings, cousins were poring over the maps of the world spread over the table. A French colony might open up to immigration because they needed people to work in gold mines. Frank was a butler in rich English home. They could use more butlers. Oh, but with a child, never. You couldn't go there. They may need somebody to stack wood. Oh, I can stack wood. I'm sure I can jack wood. Italy, my parents' honeymoon had been spent there. But Mussolini, no, 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 no. Australia, well, who wants to live amongst a bunch of convicts? Norway, cold, cold. And I don't even have a fur coat, my mother said. And my father, always the lecturer, said, what? You don't know where Kenya is? Africa's on the coast. Don't forget, they're French, Italian, and British colony. It's not that simple. Colonies? What are colonies? Clusters of houses? Why would they pick those far-off places to build colonies of houses? Questions that were easily answered, but they really, really showed the despair we were in. And then my father had this bright idea. He said, hey, you know, you're learning English. You have a tutor in English. I'm going to the American consulate. I'm going to look for our namesakes, the Lustigs, in a telephone book. Major cities, Detroit, Minneapolis, New York, Los Angeles. And he gave me those addresses, and I must have written in my schoolgirl handwriting over 50 letters to ask if X would be good enough to sponsor us for American visas. For weeks, we waited for replies while I speculated how the letter's recipient would hold each envelope, would open it, would find my English understandable, my handwriting is acceptable, he would show it to his wife, to his children maybe, and surely, surely we'd become friends. Well, we eventually received half a dozen replies consisting of polite and firm denials, excluded. So when somebody said to my father, you know, they're giving out visas to Shanghai, why don't you go there? And my father did go there, and my father came home with 3 visas, and he held it up, and he said, look, if everything fails, we can always go to Shanghai. And my mother said, Shanghai? Isn't that where they kill white people? And my father, I said to my father, was it hard to get this? No, no, no. She said, they just got in line, and you stood in line, and they stamped it, and stamped it, and stamped it, and we got out. It was easy. And my mother said, did you have to speak Chinese? Oh, no, they spoke German. That's how it was. And since at that time, my father's brother's body bag had come back from Dachau. He was dead. And since at that time, I had been preparing to be an ice skater for the Austrian national competitions. And they had taken me aside and had said, ja, gnädiges Fräulein, es tut mir so leid. Die neuen Rassengesetze, die erlauben nicht, dass eine Jüdin kann da sein. Oh, dear lady, I'm so sorry. The new racial laws, they just don't permit for a Jewish girl, anybody to participate in Austrian. Anyway, I said, that's it, let's go, get out of here, be done with it. So this is all an introduction to tell you that when Manli Ho came to our house, lost my page here, and we sat down at a tea ceremony, and we looked up to our passports, and she said, oh, there you are, that's my father's signature. He was trying to help Jews. And I said, no, 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 this was just a routine thing, it was a bureaucratic thing. No, she said, my father knew that with a Shanghai visa, you maybe could get out. And I looked at her, I was dumbfounded. Do you remember that? I couldn't believe that this had been an actual act of kindness, a human effort, and we didn't know about it. Here I was now 59, 60 years old, no, I was older, I was 75. I'd been living with this myth that we went to Shanghai through our own efforts, to what we had achieved, not to somebody trying to help us. It made a huge turnaround to me. And that night, when I thought about it, and I was really agitated by then, I wrote a letter. Let me find it here. To Dr. Ho, and I wrote it on behalf of my dead father. And I said, me to my dead father, I just heard the most amazing thing about our visas to Shanghai, and I tell him about it. My father, my dead father, speaking to me. No, that can't be. I remember it clearly. It was a cold day, and I was freezing, and the man in front of me just said, just hold your passports and you get a visa. And after all, standing in line is what we all did in those days, me. But I just learned it was more than that. Our visas were the result of a deliberate act of human resourcefulness and kindness, my father. Why didn't anybody tell us that? Me. Nobody knew. Well, my father. But then if nobody knew, I feel badly. Shanghai saved our lives, except my own. He died, like your father, at age 47 of kidney cancer. Me, what would you have liked to say to the Herr Consul? My father says, I would like to tell him now, ja, das war eine große Sache, die Sie getan haben. Ich will Ihnen wirklich danken, sehr geehrter Herr Konsul. Das haben wir gar nicht verstanden. Bitte entschuldigen Sie uns. Es war eine wirkliche schwere Zeit. Vielen, vielen Dank. Wir haben nicht einmal Ihren Namen gewusst. Oder ist es jetzt schon zu spät? Yes, that was a big deal what you did for us. I want to truly thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Consul. We truly didn't understand this. Please forgive us. It was a terribly difficult time. Oh, so many, many thanks. We didn't even know your name. Or is it too late now? It's ironic. The tone of voice I'm using was the tone of voice that we Jews used with anybody we thought was superior, because we had really been conditioned to being oppressed. And 3 days later, Manli Ho wrote me back, and she said, on behalf of her dead father, Herr Lustig, you're most welcome, but neither thanks nor apologies are necessary, because, as you say, it was a terribly difficult time. I told my daughter, Manli, during such tragic times, it's natural to feel compassion and to want to help. And in reality, I have been thanked many times over by seeing your daughter become such a young de Ren, a useful person. And although we didn't have a chance to meet each other, we have now met through our daughters. That's what it's all about, don't you think? It was a moment of reconciliation and the beginning of a wonderful friendship with Manli. So I wrote, I was excited. I thought I'd discovered something, I'd come on something. And I wrote to all my Shanghai friends, my girlfriends, same age as mine, said, guess what happened? This wasn't just an accident, the bureaucratic freak out. We got those visas. And then I was surprised because my girlfriends made a sort of a pushback. They said, oh, Lotte, it's no big thing. We got out on our own. It wasn't that hard. We had to bribe a few people. In Shanghai, nobody wanted us anyway. So that's how we did it. But behind that question, I began to see they were questioning her. They were saying sort of, what was in it for her? Why is she doing all of this? Is righteousness not enough? Is my answer. But then I also realized, and at that time I was a psychologist, that sometimes survivors have to cling to their stories of oppression, need to cling to their belief that they left Vienna by their own fortitude, that they left Vienna on their own efforts, and that perhaps there is a jealousy of the keep hanging on to their own martyrdom. Anyway, I wrote up this story, and it's in Judaica, and it was published, and that was satisfying. But then Manli told me the other revelation, which she told you here before, namely that her father was actually demoted for all of this. She said the Chinese had a long-standing commercial relationship with Germany. China had tungsten, which the Germans had to import to build up their military industry, and China in turn was buying a lot of military hardware to fight communists. The Chinese did not want to lose that relationship with the Germans. And here, the Herr Consul, this important person in our life, was being punished by the same people that was punishing us. That also blew me away. And the other thing that became astonishing, that at the time when the Chinese consulate took Dr. Ho away to another position, when he became a military analyst and a bureaucrat in the office, there was no one there to stamp visas. Shanghai also closed the doors to us. That is, the municipal government, which Rene described to you, decreed that you needed 300 pounds, 300 British pounds, to come into Shanghai. Didn't need visas, just needed money so you wouldn't become a nuisance to anybody. Well, that would have done it for us. In other words, not only was I now in the possession of the knowledge that this was a conscious act of kindness to bring us to Shanghai, that we only had a small window of opportunity, or we would have been lost in Europe with our other relatives. And at one point I asked Manli, where did you learn your Chinese? And she said, I learned it at my father's knees. He wanted me to learn Chinese. And then I said, oh my God, we had 7.5 years in Shanghai. We never learned, or very few of us learned Chinese. I learned the pidgin Chinese, never learned Mandarin. And I say here, in a city of 8 to 10 million Chinese native speakers and 120,000 foreign speakers, I got English in 9 months. I spoke fluent English. It couldn't have been so difficult, could it have, if someone had pushed me in a direction to learn Chinese? What a great opportunity, what a great culture. But the Shanghai Jewish School, which I attended from 1939 to 1941, Mrs. O'Dwyer, who taught British history, not Chinese. Mendel Brown taught Jewish history, not Chinese. Mrs. Hacking taught English grammar and composition. Mr. Kahan, a Russian immigrant, taught French, not Chinese. And the only ones who spoke Chinese were the cooks in the kitchen, whom we never saw. The signs that the Chinese were second-class citizens at the time we were there were everywhere. At the British Club, that was only open to the British, not to the Chinese. At the expensive race course, there was a sign that said dogs and Chinese not allowed. And my parents were so proud of my English, and they used me as interpreters like I have seen Spanish-speaking Mexican do here. I was the child that was going to introduce them and manage the affairs, do what needed to be done. Because they said, not Chinese, with English you can get along everywhere in the world. The fact is, in Shanghai, we were inculcated with British culture, the culture of the empire. At age 13 and 14, as Rene said, we joined the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, whose mission was that, quote, a scout would be a friend to all, excluding, of course, the Chinese. There was no Chinese kid in our troop. I never had a Chinese girlfriend, and I never had a Chinese boyfriend. One day, perhaps in the summer before Pearl Harbor, the founder and director, Lord Baden-Powell himself, came and reviewed our troops. It was hot, hot. Monsoon heat, 104 degrees. With right hand pressed over our heart, some several hundreds of white children watched as a Union Jack was raised on a high flagpole. Our children's voices intoned, God save the King. And the king by now was just a British god, a British king over there. He would exert a power so strong that from this outpost, way in the Far East, he would fight our war, save lives, and restore justice over there. But none of us ever discussed this at our increasingly sparse dinner table, because all we could do was really go day to day and not starve and not get sick. When I said this to Manli, half apologetically, she said, of course, she writes to me, the Chinese were oppressed, and she picked it up immediately, I think. And she said that, of course, the Chinese were oppressed from years of colonialism and their own internal divisions. And you too were oppressed. You all were struggling for survival. And the reasons the Chinese are so defensive, have their own face to lose, is because they have suffered years of oppression, internal and external. So I was there, Manli. I was there in 1946 when the American soldiers came, and they came from the Far East theater of war, and they came to Shanghai. and I was there when they took over Nanking Road, Bubbling Well Road. They threw colonialism over within seconds. They took the rickshaws, they took the rickshaw boys that were the pullers, the runners of the rickshaw, they put them in the rickshaw, and these American Marines made races up and down Bubbling Well Road, Nanking Road, and they had a ball. And the Chinese stood on the side, and they were smiling. They weren't telling us what they were thinking. Perhaps it was their face. But within weeks and months, signs came up. Yankees go home. Yankees go home. So I realized that I have lived at a time before you were born. You were not there when colonialism ended. You were a child in Cairo in 1949, when the third world, when this Chinese world actually exploded. When communism had come to the mainland, the nationalists fled to Taiwan. They established the Republic of China as opposed to the People's Republic of China. So I'm asking you today, your father's a free man, a man with a passport, a man with a job for a government. What was your father's reaction to China's collapse? What did this righteous man hope for? After all, he was born in 1901. He was 10 or 11 when Sun Yat-sen, for a brief moment, a Confucian socialist, became president, who was then assassinated by the Kuomintang. He was the precursor to Chiang Kai-shek. What did you talk about your dinner table in the 1960s, in the 1970s? Were you, like me as a child, listening the way I listened in Vienna? Did you imbibe with your mother's milk the inner divisions in China? What kind of adjustment your father should make? How did he really feel? Did he have faced a shame at being demoted? Did he leave with some form of reconciliation that I was trying to seek? And so one last twist that I need to talk about that bears on this. In 2004, I'm in the office of Dr. Dwight Chen, a Chinese-American oncologist. He is laparoscopically removing a cancer from my uterus. And he says, in the way doctors like to sort of side-swipe the real issue, he said, say, I hear you were in Shanghai. Is that true? Were you in Shanghai? He said, I'd love to go visit the city. Oh, I said, were you born here? He said, no, my parents fled to Shanghai. What? He said they were refugees. What kind of refugees? Refugees from Nanking. And he put into my hand this book. It's called The Rape of Nanking. And I'm going to read you one short excerpt. From him, I had to learn that while 22,000 refugees had come to Shanghai from Vienna, from Poland, from Berlin, 340,000 had come bloodied on a terrible train rides, ignored, harassed, persecuted into Shanghai. And I wasn't aware of it until I'm 70-some years old. Frank Xing, now practitioner of Oriental medicine in San Francisco, recalls the hectic, nightmarish conditions under which he and his parents left Nanking during the autumn of 1937. Then a boy of 11, he packed his precious collection of slingshots and marbles for the journey, while his grandmother gave his father, a railway mechanic, bracelets of jade and silver to pawn in the event of a future emergency. The train that bore his family to Hankow and then to Shanghai was so packed that hundreds of refugees unable to get seats sat on top of the compartments, while others, also unable to get seats, literally strapped themselves underneath the train, their bodies hanging only inches above the tracks. Throughout the journey, Jing heard rumors that people had fallen off the train or rolled under the wheels. Jing himself barely survived the trip when Japanese bombers attacked the train, forcing his family to jump out and hide in a cemetery. When I read that book, and I had made my connection to Manli and everything she had brought out in me, maybe I brought something out in her, I asked myself, Why didn't we take in a Chinese child? Why would we ignore that? And then immediately in a dialogue with myself, I said, oh, how could we? We lived in one room, just like Rene said. We had barely enough food. The Americans and Japanese were bombing us. There were 18 areas in all. How could we have taken in a Chinese? And then the words that Dr. Ho wrote to me through Manli Ho came back. In terrible times, we have to have compassion for those who are not so fortunate. And then I realized, and this was my insight, that I was now on the outside. I could ask this question because I was no longer a victim. When you're a victim, you're enclosed by your preoccupation, by your obsession with surviving. You cannot think of the other poor Chinese on the other side who are also oppressed. And they cannot think about you. But now that I was reading this story in the safety of America with a passport, I began to return to what I think is faith in normalcy, faith in kindness, faith in the spontaneous act, which when you are in the grip of such violence, it's not possible. So these acts of kindness then are really important. But as I look around, now that I have looked at this and at this, I'm going to quote you other people who are still in need. There's genocide, Darfur, Bosnia, Kenya, Somalia, Cambodia, Chechen, Rwanda. I see internally displaced persons in divided countries. Germany actually has become reunited. The Hmong, the Kurds, North Korea, Taiwan, Israel. The forced migrations, the Iraqis, 2 million of them are swarming into Syria, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Turkey, while we in America are holding back visas. I have come to appreciate that truths are plural, that it's easy for ordinary people to become swept by tumultuous currents of history, that re-editing our stories will never bring us to a point of rest, that still in Shanghai we were lucky because we didn't lose our, quote, faith in normalcy, or we lost it and we regained it with my nightmares, with my insights. I was being restored. I was being healed. The return to communal life for us was still possible, not because we were so clever, but because we were lucky. The humiliation that is imprinted and branded in Holocaust survivors who've been in the camps have a far harder journey to come back from where they were imprinted. And so, as we speak, there are still hundreds of thousands, stateless, visa-less, homeless people. They are in flight. They crowd into overloaded fishing boats. They trudge through tropical forests. They climb icy mountain passes, brace attack dogs, brutal order guards, wayward brigands, cynical bounty hunters, to arrive, if they're lucky, at some place to be free and to heal. So where to find redemption, vindication, reconstruction? I want to end with a few lines by the distinguished songwriter, poet, Leonard Cohen, who has consistently over the last 50 years railed against deceit, violence, cruelty, and fraud. He always inserts hints of redemption, not promises of redemption, and that's what I want to honor. So these are a few lines from Anthem by Leonard Cohen. The birds, they sing at break of day. Start again, I hear them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away or what has yet to be. And the chorus is, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in. That's how the light comes in. Thank you very much.